Well, kia ora, All Saints. It's been great to be with you over the last couple of weeks, one during Pentecost, and then last week we had a building conversation, and both of those, I think, were really encouraging spaces for us, and so I hope you've engaged with them well, and we're now working our way through our Deuteronomy series. We're in step 2 of Deuteronomy. Last week, Emily brought us this idea of the covenant, and the fact that these people have made a covenant with God and are living in that covenant through Moses and Abraham and even as far back as Noah. We're going to cover the themes of Deuteronomy over 5 weeks. So last week was covenant. This week we're talking about trusting and obeying. Next week we're going to be talking about remembering. Week 4 we're going to be talking about the Shema, one of the really key parts of Deuteronomy. And then week 5 we're going to be talking about blessing and curses. Now, just for a bit of background on Deuteronomy, it's basically broken into 3 parts. Moses makes a speech for the first 11 chapters. Then there's the laws in the second bit. And then there's Moses' second speech, which is chapters 27 to 34. Within that, there's little breakups as well. So chapters 1 to 3 is the story so far, what's happened for the Israelites since they came out of Egypt, and how they've rebelled against God, despite Him offering this salvation, and despite Him being ever faithful to His covenant, they rebel all the time. Chapters 4 to 11 are talking more about being faithful to the covenant more than the previous generation. So Deuteronomy, if you remember, is we're standing on the banks of the Promised Land. We're standing just about to enter it, and it's a new generation that gets to inherit it. Everybody else except one person gets to enter doesn't get to enter the Promised Land. And in fact, it's a new generation that enters it because of their rebellion against God. In the laws, they're broken up very simply into worship in the first part, leaders in the next part, and then there's civil laws and social justice. And really these laws set Israel apart from their neighbors. They are not necessarily laws that we'd have nowadays, but they are laws that were radically different than their neighbors. It called them back to social justice and to caring for the poor, which was not a thing that happened in this. And we're going to cover a bit of that today. And then the last bit is Moses' second speech. And basically he gives a warning and an ultimatum, and then he has some last words, and then he actually dies at the end of Deuteronomy. So let's begin today. We're talking about trust and obey, and we have this little negotiation that happens at our dinner table every night in our house. Basically how it goes is our 3-year-old Leon does not want to eat his dinner. And we hear complaining and moaning, and it's all through dinner. It's disgusting, which we say, we haven't even tried it yet. Or I'm full. You know, like my stomach's full. I just want to go play. Or I didn't want to eat that. Or I'm full again. You know, and it's just this groaning and complaining and grumbling that we hear at our dinner table. So we've set up this kind of system that if Leon finishes his dinner, he gets to enjoy dessert. It's a free thing that we give him. We give him dessert freely, and but he has to finish his dinner. This is a lesson for Leon, I think, in obedience and trust. He has to trust mum and dad, that mum and dad will provide the dessert at the end of him completing his task. But he also has to learn to obey. He has to learn to eat his dinner and do what we say, or that's kind of, he doesn't get the reward. Now, do we know what's best for Leon as parents? Yes, absolutely. 3-year-old is not necessarily the best judge of character. They'd probably eat chocolate all day if they thought they were going to have dinner every night. Is what we're asking reasonable? Well, we think so. We don't give him a huge meal. We give him a little plate. You know, it's enough to fill his stomach. It's good for him. It's got a mixture of veggies and meat and all those sorts of things. And ultimately, what we're asking him to do is actually best for him. So as much as it's a rule or a law, it's actually the best thing of how he can live his life. Now, I think this is huge kind of correlations to how Israel behave. There's the Father or God, and then there's the the child or the Israelites, and there's that grumbling that goes on in the desert. There's the, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do what God says. I want to do something different. Or I'm not used to that way. I want to do it another way. Now, does God know the best for his people? Absolutely. Does God, what he asks, unreasonable? Well, I think we'll discover that as we go through today. But basically, Moses is standing here on the edge of the promised land, telling his people once again, how do you trust God? That God says what says he will do. How do you trust him to do that? And also, how do they obey so that they get the best for them in the land they're about to inherit? Which brings us to our first reading, the reading that probably most of you will have read. It's Deuteronomy 1:32 to 40. If you haven't read it, pause the video and go read it, and then we'll come back. Now, this part of Deuteronomy is God reminding his people of the unfaithfulness of the previous generation. It's sort of saying, don't do the mistakes of what your fathers and mothers and grandfathers and grandmothers did. They didn't live up, they didn't trust God to provide, they grumbled and moaned, and ultimately they rebelled against what God was trying to do. And so Moses is standing there reminding the people, and these really are the words of God. God is reminding the people again of their lack of following through on their part of the covenant. God said he would do this, and so you have to, live up to your part of the covenant. Now, we'll answer in a moment, a wee way down the track, what will God do? But this is kind of the next part of Deuteronomy, and we're going to just take some examples from through it, is all about what they have to do to uphold their part of the covenant. So this is reframed. It's the same laws, but it's reframed for them entering the promised land. So for instance, in Deuteronomy 12, 1 to 7, we read that basically Israel had to have their own worship space. One worship space. They had to pick one place out of all other places, and that was their place that they would worship. That's where they would bring their burnt offerings and sacrifices, their tithes and their special gifts. There in the presence of God, that would be where God, was most evident, and that was to be the temple in Jerusalem. Now, this is radically different from their neighbors. He's saying you have to have one meeting place. Their neighbors would have had many meeting places to many different gods. They had to have one meeting place to one God. So they're to be different already. And God knows that this is the best thing for them, because what he's seen in the desert is they actually worshipped other gods when they had other places to kind of go or worship. They were to be different. They were to be his people. They were to worship him alone. And so therefore they were to have one place. So it's an example of something that he's instilling as law. But the reality is actually it's best for them in this land. Another example, so that's from the worship section. From the leader section, in chapter 17, verses 14 to 20, Moses basically outlines, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you've taken possession of it and settled in, and you say, let us set a king over all the people, basically that king is to remind himself of the law every day. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites and turn from the law to run to the right or to the left. So this is the law that God is setting down for his kings and his leaders of his people in the future. If we think about the other nations' kings around them, the other nations' kings were considered gods. They were considered deities. They were impenetrable. They were, people that everybody revered and looked up to and untouchable. But not so in Israel. Instead, the king is meant to be worshipping God and called out as one from amongst their people. There he is humbling. This law is a reality to humble that king and keep that king in his rightful place. He is not better than anyone else in Israel. He is just chosen as the leader of Israel. So is it best for them? Absolutely. Is it what God would want for them? Absolutely. When we enter the last section of the laws and we look at an example from there, if we go to chapter 19, verses 15 to 19, this is talking about when some testimony comes against someone about them breaking the law. And it says, one witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of any crime or offence that they may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So again, I mean, this is for the people. This is to help them live in the land. This is to help them live their best life, to be their best, and to not actually take people away. Just God recognizes the brokenness of humanity and that people will lie, but actually there's a reality here of helping the people to understand how to follow process and how to have justice that is right and care for people so that others just wouldn't take advantage of that. And so in all of this, it's like our dessert rule at home. God is setting up some rules, but the rules are not designed to be things that is just black and white. That's how it goes. They're designed to be the best for Israel. They're designed to set the people up well to follow God and to live his ways and to live a different way to their neighbors and uphold justice and care for the poor and care for those that are less in the society. That's what God's asking them to do. Now, will they obey is the question. And then we get to the end bit, which is basically where God sets out what he will do. So in our case, it's give ice cream or whatever's for dessert that night, a strawberry. In chapter 28, God says, if you obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. All these blessings will come on you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. You'll be blessed in the city, blessed in the country. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, the crops of your land and the young of your livestock, the calves of your herds and the lambs of your flocks. Your basket and your kneading trough will be blessed. You will be blessed when you come in and blessed when you go out. Basically, God is saying, I will be there. I will be with you. I will be pouring out everything that is in heaven upon you. That is God's promise to these people. When we said there's a covenant between these people, we can see that in the story so far of Israel. But even in the little time they spent in the wilderness, there's a story of rebellion, of them working against God. For instance, they'd seen him rescue them from Egypt. That was a free gift. That was free gift. And now he asked them to follow them. He'd poured water out of a rock. He'd given manna from heaven that just lands in the desert, and they had to go out and collect it every day. But basically, he provided for them day in, day out. And there was a pillar of fire and a cloud of smoke that followed them everywhere and conquered other nations and protected them and kept them safe and made sure they never... So this God is already providing a lot for them. He has already provided a lot for them. He has rescued them freely. But now he asks them to trust him and to obey him. Now, when I think of this and when I look at the Deuteronomy and the Israelite people, often my question is, how could these people, they've seen all these amazing things happen. They've been rescued out of Egypt. How can these people not trust and obey God? Well, I think sometimes we're the same. We see Jesus has set us up to be a people who are different to our neighbours. He has set us up to see, we've seen the miracle of God, and yet we still do not trust. It's something in us as humans. It's the same for us. We need to learn to trust and obey what God wants us to do. How often do you struggle to do what God wants you to do? Do you actually fully trust Jesus to provide for you? When we're in the midst of a trial or a struggle, do we rely on him to pull us through, or do we rely on our own strength and our own resources and our own perspective? I think Deuteronomy has a lot to say to us, that God is continuing to call us to trust him and to bring good from bad and light in times of darkness. The people of Israel get it wrong, and we know that they continue to get it wrong, because in the end, Jesus is sent. Jesus is the perfect human, the one who does trust fully and obeys God fully, even to death on a cross. And in our second reading today, which is Matthew 6, Jesus is halfway through the Sermon on the Mount, and he reminds his people to trust God. He says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasure in heaven where rot and moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven." Trust God to provide for you. Don't ferret it away in a corner so that you can protect yourself, but actually trust God to care for you. Or he continues, no one can serve two masters. You can't serve money and mammon and God. And then he finishes by saying, don't worry, pray about everything. Do not worry saying, what will we eat, what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? Trust God to provide for you because he does for the sparrows. But trust requires vulnerability. There's always that thing in the back of the mind, what if he doesn't? There is this place where trust is built by him continually doing it. It's like a muscle we have to build up. But if we're obedient to trusting God and we love him with all our heart, soul, strength, and love, and we love our neighbours, and we're faithful to our part of the covenant, what we've found is that God is faithful. He is providing, and he does bless us. We are like Leon. We need to obey and trust, to remind ourselves that God is faithful. And we need to be reminded of that lesson again and again. How often do we not trust God with his kind of ways and his rules, and instead we rely on ourselves? Maybe in the end, following that way gives us life and life to the full and freedom for us. So that's the question this morning. Will you obey? Will you trust God? I hope you have a great discussion in your house churches this morning.